The mess hall buzzed with the usual evening chatter as hundreds of soldiers lined up for dinner. Steam rose from the metal trays filled with mashed potatoes, gravy, and what the kitchen staff generously called beef stew. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the long tables, where tired men and women in uniform sat after another grueling day of training. Private Jake Morrison had been having the worst week of his military career. His drill sergeant had been on his case about everything, from his messy bunk to his slow reaction time during drills. The two-year-old from small-town Texas was beginning to question his decision to enlist. The promises of adventure and honor seemed far away when he was scrubbing toilets and getting screamed at for minor infractions. As Jake moved through the food line, his frustration grew. The server slapped a particularly unappetizing portion of stew onto his tray, and some of the brown liquid splashed onto his freshly cleaned uniform. He muttered under his breath, drawing a sharp look from the mess hall supervisor. Near the end of the line, Jake noticed someone had cut in front of him. The person wore a standard military uniform, but Jake was too focused on his anger to pay attention to any rank insignia. His vision was clouded by weeks of pent-up frustration and exhaustion. "Hey," Jake called out loudly. "The line's back there, buddy. We've all been waiting." The figure ahead didn't turn around immediately. This only made Jake angrier. He had been taught that respect and order were everything in the military. And here was someone blatantly disregarding the rules. "I'm talking to you," Jake said, stepping forward and tapping the person on the shoulder with more force than necessary. When the figure turned around, Jake saw it was a woman, probably in her early 30s, with short brown hair and intelligent eyes. She looked at him calmly, without any sign of fear or surprise. This somehow made Jake even more irritated. He expected an apology, maybe some embarrassment at being caught cutting in line. "You think because you're—" Jake started to say, but stopped mid-sentence. He had been about to make an assumption about why she thought she could cut in line, but something in her steady gaze made him pause. "Excuse me?" she said quietly, her voice carrying a tone that should have warned Jake to back down. But Jake was too wound up to read the warning signs. His buddies at the nearby tables were watching now, and he felt he had to follow through. In his mind, this was about fairness and military protocol. Everyone had to wait their turn, regardless of who they were. "You cut in line," Jake said, his voice getting louder. "That's not how things work here. We all follow the same rules." The woman studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Around them, the normal mess hall noise was starting to quiet down as more people noticed the confrontation. The woman seemed to be giving Jake a chance to reconsider his approach, but he was too angry to take it. "Look, lady," Jake continued, his Texas drawl becoming more pronounced as his irritation grew. "I don't care what your story is. Rules are rules. Get to the back of the line like everyone else." The woman remained perfectly calm. "Soldier, I think you should take a closer look at who you're talking to." But Jake was beyond listening to reason. The stress of military life, the constant criticism, and his general unhappiness had built up into this moment. He saw her calm response as arrogance, as if she thought she was better than everyone else. "I don't need to look at anything," Jake snapped. "What I see is someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them." The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter now. Other soldiers were turning in their seats to watch the drama unfold. Some of them had expressions of horror on their faces, but Jake was too focused on his anger to notice. "You know what your problem is?" Jake continued, his voice carrying across the mess hall. "You think you're special. You think you can just do whatever you want, because—" "Morrison." The sharp voice cut through Jake's rant like a knife. He turned to see Sergeant Rodriguez hurrying toward him, his face pale with what looked like panic. Behind him, several other NCOs were moving quickly in their direction. "Morrison, stand down immediately," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with urgency. Jake looked confused. "Sarge, I was just telling this lady that she needs to—" "Shut up, Morrison," Rodriguez hissed. "Shut up right now and step back." The urgency in his sergeant's voice finally broke through Jake's anger. He looked around and noticed that the entire mess hall had gone silent. Hundreds of soldiers were staring at him, and their expressions ranged from shock to pity to outright horror. Slowly, Jake's eyes returned to the woman he had been confronting. For the first time, he really looked at her uniform. His gaze traveled from her boots up to her chest, where he saw ribbons and decorations that seemed to go on forever. Service ribbons, combat medals, commendation awards. More military honors than Jake had ever seen on one person. But it was when his eyes reached her collar that his blood turned to ice. There, gleaming under the harsh mess hall lights, were the 3 stars that marked her as a lieutenant general. Jake felt his knees go weak. A lieutenant general. He had just told a 3-star general to go to the back of the line. He had raised his voice at one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire base, in front of hundreds of witnesses. The woman, General Patricia Hayes, as Jake would soon learn, continued to watch him with that same calm expression. She seemed almost curious about what he would do next, like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. "Oh God," Jake whispered, so quietly that only Rodriguez heard him. The mess hall remained frozen in silence. The kitchen staff had stopped serving food. The conversations at every table had died away completely. Even the usual clanking of silverware against trays had ceased. General Hayes finally spoke, her voice clear and carrying easily across the silent room. "Soldier, what's your name and unit?" Jake's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. "Private Morrison, ma'am. Jake Morrison. 3rd Battalion, Bravo Company." "I see," General Hayes said. "And how long have you been in the Army, Private Morrison?" 4 months, ma'am," Jake managed to croak out. 4 months, she repeated thoughtfully. "And in those 4 months, has anyone taught you how to read rank insignia?" Jake's face burned with embarrassment. "Yes, ma'am." "Has anyone explained to you the proper way to address superior officers?" "Yes, ma'am." "And has anyone mentioned that it's generally considered poor form to put your hands on a senior officer without permission?" Jake realized with horror that he had grabbed her shoulder earlier. "Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yes, they told me not to." "Ma'am," General Hayes nodded slowly. "I see. So you understand the gravity of what just happened here?" "Yes, ma'am," Jake whispered. The general looked around the mess hall, taking in the sea of stunned faces. When she spoke again, her voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it. "This is an interesting moment, Private Morrison. You've just demonstrated a remarkable lack of situational awareness, military courtesy, and basic respect. In front of approximately 400 of your fellow soldiers, Jake wanted to disappear into the floor. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "However," General Hayes continued, "I'm curious about something. You mentioned that everyone should follow the same rules. That's actually a principle I believe in strongly, so tell me, what rule did you think I was breaking?" Jake's mind raced. I thought you cut in line." "Ma'am, I see. And why did you think that?" Jake looked around desperately, hoping someone would help him, but every face in the mess hall was watching him with a mixture of sympathy and morbid fascination. I saw you get in line ahead of me, ma'am. I thought you just walked up to the front." General Hayes nodded. "An understandable mistake. However, if you had been paying attention, you would have noticed that I was walking with Colonel Martinez, who was showing me through the dining facilities as part of a base inspection. We weren't getting food. We were observing the meal service." Jake felt his stomach drop even further. Not only had he confronted a general, but he had been completely wrong about what was happening. "Moreover," General Hayes continued, "if you had taken a moment to look around, you might have noticed the small entourage of officers who have been following us through our inspection tour." For the first time, Jake looked beyond the general and saw a group of high-ranking officers standing nearby, all watching him with expressions of disbelief. "So, Private Morrison," General Hayes said, "what have we learned today?" Jake struggled to find words. I learned to pay attention better, ma'am. And to think before I act. Those are good lessons. Any others?" Jake's mind was blank with terror. "I don't know, ma'am. How about this one? When you make assumptions, you make poor decisions. When you let anger control your actions, you make enemies, and when you fail to show proper respect, you face consequences. Yes, ma'am. General Hayes studied him for a long moment. Private Morrison, you're going to remember this day for the rest of your life. The question is, will you remember it as the day you learned important lessons about leadership and respect? Or as the day you threw away your military career over a misunderstanding in a mess hall? Jake's throat was so tight he could barely speak. I hope it's the first one, ma'am. So do I, Private. So do I. And other. So do I. General Hayes turned to Sergeant Rodriguez. Sergeant, please escort Private Morrison to his commanding officer. I'll be having a conversation with Captain Williams about this incident. Yes, ma'am, Rodriguez said quickly. As Jake was led away from the mess hall, he could feel hundreds of eyes following him. The silence was finally breaking as conversations resumed, but he knew that what had just happened would be the talk of the base for weeks to come. Walking across the base toward his company headquarters, Jake realized that his life had just changed completely. He had no idea what punishment was coming, but he knew it would be severe. More than that, he knew that every officer on the base would soon know his name and his story. The foolish soldier who struck a general in the mess hall, not knowing she would ruin his career instantly. The story was already writing itself in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. As they reached the company building, Sergeant Rodriguez finally spoke. Morrison, I've been in the Army for 15 years, and I have never seen anything like what you just did. How bad is it, Sarge? Jake asked quietly. Rodriguez looked at him with something between pity and amazement. Son, that was General Hayes. She's one of the most respected officers in the entire military. She's commanded troops in 3 different combat zones, and is being considered for a 4th star. Jake felt sick. What's going to happen to me? I honestly don't know, Rodriguez said. But I can tell you this. Your military career just took a turn that no amount of training could have prepared you for. As they climbed the steps to the company headquarters, Jake tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 5 minutes, he had gone from being an anonymous private with normal problems to being the most famous soldier on the base, for all the wrong reasons. The door to the company building loomed ahead of him like the entrance to a courtroom. Whatever was about to happen, Jake knew that the young man who had been angry about mess hall lines was about to face consequences that would reshape his entire future. The incident in the mess hall was over, but Private Jake Morrison's real ordeal was just beginning. Captain Williams looked up from his desk as Sergeant Rodriguez knocked on the doorframe. The company commander was a veteran officer in his mid-30s, known for being fair but strict. He had been reviewing training reports when his phone rang with news that made him question whether he had heard correctly. Sir, Private Morrison reporting as ordered, Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying a tension that Captain Williams had rarely heard from the experienced NCO. Jake stood at attention, his face pale, and his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The short walk from the mess hall to the company headquarters had felt like a death march. Every soldier they passed had stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Captain Williams studied Jake for a long moment before speaking. Private Morrison, I just received a very interesting phone call from Colonel Martinez. He informed me that you had an encounter with General Hayes in the mess hall. Is this accurate? Yes, sir, Jake managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The colonel also mentioned that this encounter involved you physically touching the general and raising your voice at her in front of several hundred witnesses. Is this also accurate? Jake's stomach churned. Yes, sir. Captain Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Private Morrison, in my 12 years as an officer, I have never had to deal with anything quite like this. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? I think so, sir. No, Private. I don't think you do. Captain Williams stood up and walked around his desk. Let me explain something to you. General Hayes is not just any 3-star general. She is the commanding general of this entire installation. She commands over 30,000 soldiers. Her recommendations can make or break careers at the highest levels of the military. Jake felt his knees weaken. He had known she was a general, but he hadn't realized she was the commanding general of the entire base. Furthermore, Captain Williams continued, General Hayes has a reputation throughout the Army. She is known for her intelligence, her tactical brilliance, and her absolute dedication to military standards. She is also known for having zero tolerance for soldiers who disrespect the uniform or the chain of command. The captain walked to his window and looked out at the base beyond. Private Morrison. What you did tonight wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophic failure of judgment that has put not only your career in jeopardy, but potentially the reputation of this entire company. Jake wanted to speak, to apologize, to somehow make this right, but words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of his error. Sir, Jake finally said, I know I messed up. I know there's no excuse for what I did. I was angry and stupid, and I wasn't paying attention, but is there anything I can do to make this right? Captain Williams turned back to face him. That, Private Morrison, is not up to me. General Hayes has requested a full report on this incident, including your complete service record, disciplinary history, and psychological evaluation. She has also requested that you report to her office tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. The blood drained from Jake's face. Her office, sir? Yes. You're going to have a personal meeting with the commanding general to discuss your future in the United States Army. Jake felt dizzy. What do you think she's going to do to me, sir? Captain Williams sat back down and studied Jake carefully. Private, I'm going to be honest with you. What you did tonight could result in anything from a severe reprimand to a court-martial. Laying hands on a superior officer, showing disrespect to a general officer, creating a public disturbance. These are serious charges under military law. Could I be discharged, sir? Discharged? Captain Williams almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Private Morrison, you could be facing much worse than discharge. You could be looking at military prison time. Jake felt his legs give way slightly, and he had to lock his knees to stay standing. However, the captain continued, General Hayes is also known for being fair. If she sees something in you worth saving, if she believes this was truly an aberration and not representative of your character, she might offer you a different path. What kind of path, sir? I have no idea, but I can tell you this. Your meeting tomorrow will determine whether you continue your military career or whether you become a cautionary tale told to new recruits about the importance of military courtesy. That evening, Jake lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, while his fellow soldiers whispered around him. Word of the incident had spread throughout the base with incredible speed. Some of the stories he overheard were exaggerated beyond recognition. But they all centered on the same basic facts. A stupid private had confronted the commanding general and was about to pay a terrible price. His bunkmate, Private Rodriguez, no relation to the sergeant, finally broke the silence. Morrison, what the hell were you thinking? Jake turned toward him. I wasn't thinking, man. That's the problem. I saw someone cut in line, and I just reacted. But didn't you see her rank? No. I was so focused on being angry that I didn't look at anything except what I thought was happening. Another soldier leaned over from the next bunk. My cousin went through basic with a guy who disrespected a colonel once. They made his life so miserable that he requested discharge just to get away from the punishment details. Yeah, but Morrison didn't just disrespect any colonel, Rodriguez said. He grabbed General Hayes. The General Hayes. She's like a legend in the army. A soldier from across the barracks called out. My drill sergeant told stories about General Hayes. She supposedly once walked 20 miles through enemy territory to rescue a trapped unit, and Morrison just told her to go to the back of a food line. Jake closed his eyes and tried to block out the conversations, but they continued around him. Each story made his situation sound worse. By the time lights out was called, Jake had heard enough rumors about General Hayes to convince him that his military career was effectively over. But sleep wouldn't come. Jake spent the night replaying the incident over and over in his mind, thinking of all the things he should have done differently. He should have looked at her uniform. He should have noticed the other officers around her. He should have controlled his anger. Most of all, he should have remembered that in the military, assumptions could be deadly. The next morning arrived far too quickly. Jake showered, shaved, and put on his cleanest uniform. He spent extra time making sure every button was properly fastened and every crease was sharp. If he was going to face judgment from the commanding general, he would at least look like a proper soldier. Sergeant Rodriguez escorted him to the headquarters building, an imposing structure that housed the base's senior leadership. As they walked through the corridors lined with portraits of distinguished military leaders, Jake felt like he was walking to his execution. The general's waiting area was staffed by a sergeant major, whose expression suggested that he had already heard about Jake's case. "Private Morrison?" he asked, though it was clearly not a question. "Yes, Sergeant Major. General Hayes will see you in 5 minutes. When you enter her office, you will stand at attention until she gives you permission to relax. You will address her as Ma'am or General Hayes at all times. You will answer her questions directly and honestly. Do you understand?" "Yes, Sergeant Major." "Good. Because, Private Morrison, this meeting will determine whether you remain in the United States Army or whether you become a civilian by the end of the week." The 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. Jake rehearsed what he would say, how he would apologize, how he would convince the general that he deserved another chance, but every scenario he imagined ended with him being told to pack his bags. Finally, the sergeant major stood up. "General Hayes, we'll see you now." Jake walked through the door into an office that was both impressive and intimidating. The walls were lined with military decorations, unit citations, and photographs of the general with various world leaders. Behind the desk sat General Hayes, looking exactly as calm and composed as she had in the mess hall. "Private Morrison, please stand at attention," she said, without looking up from the file she was reading. Jake snapped to the position of attention, his eyes focused straight ahead. He could see that the file in front of General Hayes was thick, presumably containing his complete military record and the reports from the previous night's incident. "Private Morrison," General Hayes said, finally looking up at him, "I've spent considerable time this morning reading about you, your service record, your test scores, your performance evaluations, and of course, the detailed reports from last night's incident." Jake remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "According to your records, you scored quite well on your aptitude tests. Your physical fitness scores are above average. Your marksmanship scores are excellent. Your drill sergeants noted that you showed leadership potential during basic training. In self, 100 deference, your ride as NT 2000, Jake wasn't sure where this was going, but it didn't sound like the beginning of a court-martial proceeding. However, General Hayes continued, and Jake's heart sank. Your recent performance has been declining. Your immediate supervisors note that you've seemed frustrated, angry, and increasingly insubordinate. Last night's incident appears to be the culmination of several weeks of poor attitude and decision-making." She closed the file and looked directly at him. "So, here's what I want to know, Private Morrison. Was last night an isolated incident of spectacularly poor judgment? Or was it representative of the kind of soldier you're becoming?" Jake had to think carefully about his answer. This felt like the most important question he had ever been asked. "Ma'am, I think it was both," he said finally. "What I did last night was the worst decision I've ever made in my life. But the attitude that led to it has been building for weeks. I've been frustrated and angry, and I let those feelings control my actions instead of remembering my training and my responsibilities." General Hayes nodded slightly. "That's an honest answer. Now tell me this. Why have you been frustrated and angry?" Odermend. Jake hesitated. He wanted to be honest, but he was afraid that explaining his frustrations would sound like he was making excuses. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" "Granted, ma'am. I joined the army because I wanted to serve my country and be part of something bigger than myself. But since I've been here, it's felt like all I do is get yelled at for small mistakes and perform meaningless tasks. I know that's probably how everyone feels at first, but I guess I expected to feel more useful." General Hayes studied him for a long moment. "Private Morrison, do you know why I was in the mess hall last night?" "You were conducting an inspection, ma'am." "That's correct." "Do you know what I was inspecting for?" "No." Jake shook his head. "No, ma'am. I was evaluating the morale and discipline of the soldiers on this base. I was looking for signs that our training programs are producing the kind of soldiers our country needs. She paused. Your outburst last night was not what I was hoping to find. Jake's heart sank. No, ma'am. However, she continued, your honesty just now tells me something important. It tells me that you're capable of self-reflection and that you understand the difference between reasons and excuses. She stood up and walked around her desk, stopping directly in front of Jake. Private Morrison, I'm going to offer you something that very few soldiers in your position ever receive. I'm going to offer you a choice. Jake waited, hardly daring to breathe. Option 1. I can process you for disciplinary action according to military regulations. Given the nature of your offense, this would likely result in reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, extra duty, and a permanent mark on your record that would follow you for the remainder of your military career. You would remain in the Army, but your opportunities for advancement would be severely limited. Jake's stomach tightened. Option 2. I can arrange for you to be transferred to a specialized unit, where soldiers with attitude problems are given intensive leadership training and real responsibilities. It's not a punishment detail. It's a program designed to salvage the careers of soldiers who have potential, but have lost their way. Jake looked at her in surprise. Ma'am? The program is demanding, Private Morrison. It requires a year-long commitment. You would be working with experienced NCOs who specialize in leadership development. You would be given real responsibilities and real challenges. But you would also be held to the highest standards of conduct and performance. What kind of responsibilities, ma'am? You would be working with new recruits, helping to train and mentor soldiers who are just entering the Army. You would be given the opportunity to be part of something bigger than yourself, as you put it. But you would also be representing the Army to young people who are looking for role models. Jake felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. However, General Hayes continued, if you choose this option and fail to meet the standards of the program, your discharge from the Army would be immediate and permanent. There would be no second chances, no appeals, and no alternative options. She walked back to her desk and sat down. Private Morrison, you have 30 seconds to decide which option you prefer. This CO of Voundy. Jake's mind raced. Option 1 meant staying in the Army but with limited prospects and a damaged reputation. Option 2 meant a real chance to prove himself, but with the risk of complete failure. Ma'am, I choose option 2. General Hayes nodded. I thought you might. Very well, Private Morrison. You will report to Sergeant Major Thompson at 0600 tomorrow morning. He will brief you on the Leadership Development Program and your new responsibilities. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Private. Thank me in a year if you successfully complete the program and become the kind of soldier I believe you can be. She picked up a pen and began writing. You are dismissed, Private Morrison. Don't make me regret this decision. I won't, ma'am. As Jake walked out of the general's office, he felt like a completely different person than the one who had walked in. The foolish soldier who had confronted a general in the mess hall was getting a second chance that he had never expected and certainly didn't deserve. But as he walked back across the base, Jake realized that the real test was just beginning. General Hayes had saved his career, but now he had to prove that her faith in him was justified. The next year would determine whether this story ended with redemption or with the complete destruction of his military future. 11 months later, Jake Morrison stood in front of a group of 20 new recruits. His uniform crisp and his bearing confident. The young men and women before him looked nervous and uncertain, just as he had felt when he first arrived at basic training. But now Jake was the one they looked to for guidance and leadership. Listen up, recruits, Jake said, his voice carrying the authority that came from hard-earned experience. Today we're going to talk about something that could save your careers and maybe your lives. Situational awareness and respect for the chain of command. The recruits straightened up, sensing that this was going to be more than just another lecture about military protocol. I'm going to tell you a true story, Jake continued, about a soldier who almost threw away his entire future because he failed to understand these principles. The soldier was me. Over the past 11 months, Jake had told this story hundreds of times, to thousands of new recruits. Each time, he relived the embarrassment and fear of that night in the mess hall. But he also remembered the lesson that had changed his life. The leadership development program had been everything General Hayes had promised and more. Under the guidance of Sergeant Major Thompson, a 20-year veteran who had worked with problem soldiers for most of his career, Jake had learned not just military skills, but life skills that went far beyond the Army. The first thing Sergeant Major Thompson taught me, Jake told the recruits, was that anger is a choice. I thought I was angry because of my circumstances, but the truth was, I was angry because I chose to focus on what was wrong instead of what I could control. The program had been brutal at first. Jake had been assigned to work with drill sergeants, helping to train new recruits while simultaneously attending leadership classes, anger management sessions, and intensive military education courses. He woke up at 0500 every morning and often didn't finish his duties until after 2,200 hours. But something remarkable had happened during those long, challenging months. Jake had discovered that he was good at teaching and mentoring. He found that he could connect with frustrated recruits because he understood their struggles. He could help them avoid the mistakes he had made because he had lived through the consequences. The second thing I learned, Jake continued his story to the current group of recruits, was that respect isn't about fear or blind obedience. Real respect comes from understanding that everyone in the military, from the newest private to the highest general, has something to contribute to our mission. As Jake spoke, he noticed a young recruit in the back row who reminded him of himself a year ago. The kid looked angry and resentful, as if he thought the whole military system was designed to make his life miserable. Jake made a mental note to talk with him privately after the session. 3 months into the program, Jake had been given his first real test. A group of new recruits had been struggling with basic combat training, and several were on the verge of being discharged for failure to adapt. Jake had been assigned to work with them as their mentor and guide. At first, the struggling recruits had resented Jake. They saw him as just another authority figure trying to tell them what to do. But Jake had learned patience from Sergeant Major Thompson, and he had learned empathy from his own mistakes. I told them about the night I confronted General Hayes, Jake had explained to Thompson after his first week with the struggling recruits. I told them that I understood what it felt like to be frustrated and angry, and that I knew those feelings could lead to decisions that would ruin their lives. Slowly, the recruits had begun to trust Jake. They saw that he wasn't trying to break them down or make them feel stupid. He was trying to help them succeed. Under his guidance, all but one of the struggling recruits had successfully completed basic training. The third thing I learned, Jake told his current audience, was that leadership isn't about being the toughest or the loudest person in the room. Leadership is about helping other people become the best versions of themselves. 6 months into the program, Jake had received an unexpected visitor. General Hayes had come to observe his work with the recruits. Jake had been nervous, remembering their last encounter. But the general had simply watched quietly as he conducted a training session on military courtesy and respect. After the session, General Hayes had asked to speak with him privately. "Private Morrison," she had said, and Jake noticed that her tone was completely different from their previous conversation. "I've been following your progress in this program. Sergeant Major Thompson tells me that you've become one of his most effective instructors." "Thank you, ma'am. I've learned a lot." "What have you learned?" Jake had thought carefully before answering. "I've learned that my attitude affects everyone around me, ma'am. When I was angry and frustrated, I made other people's jobs harder. Now that I'm focused on helping others succeed, I feel like I'm actually contributing to the mission." General Hayes had nodded approvingly. "That's a valuable lesson, Private. But I'm curious about something else. How do you feel about what happened in the mess hall 11 months ago?" Jake had been surprised by the question. "I'm embarrassed about it, ma'am. But I'm also grateful." "Grateful?" "Yes, ma'am, because it led to this opportunity. If I hadn't made that mistake, I never would have discovered that I could be good at teaching and mentoring. I never would have learned what real leadership looks like." General Hayes had smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I was hoping you would say." Now, as Jake finished his story to the current group of recruits, he saw the same expressions he had seen hundreds of times before: Some of the recruits looked shocked that someone could be so stupid as to confront a general. Others looked thoughtful, as if they were recognizing their own potential for similar mistakes. The point of this story, Jake concluded, isn't that I'm an idiot, although that's certainly true. The point is that every one of you will face moments where you have to choose between letting your emotions control you or taking responsibility for your actions and your attitude. A recruit raised her hand. What happened to you after the program? Did you get in trouble for what you did? Jake smiled. That's an interesting question. Technically, I was never formally disciplined for the mess hall incident. General Hayes used her discretion to put me in this program instead. But the real consequence was that I had to face the fact that my attitude was holding me back from becoming the soldier I wanted to be. Another recruit asked, "Did you ever see General Hayes again?" Actually, yes. She visited the program several times to observe my progress. And last month, she was at my promotion ceremony. The recruits looked confused. Promotion ceremony? Jake grinned and pointed to his sleeve, where sergeant's stripes were clearly visible. 3 weeks ago, I was promoted to sergeant. General Hayes presented my stripes personally. The recruits murmured among themselves, clearly impressed. But here's the thing, Jake continued. The promotion wasn't a reward for surviving the leadership program. It was recognition that I had become the kind of soldier who could be trusted with responsibility for other people's welfare. And that transformation didn't happen because of punishment or fear. It happened because I finally understood what it meant to serve something bigger than myself. After the session ended, Jake approached the angry-looking recruit he had noticed earlier. "Hey, what's your name?" "Private Collins, Sergeant." "Collins, can we talk for a minute?" The recruit shrugged, clearly not enthusiastic about the prospect. "I noticed you looked pretty frustrated during the session. Want to tell me what's on your mind?" Collins looked around to make sure no one else was listening. "Sergeant, can I ask you something? Do you really believe all that stuff about attitude and choice? Or are you just saying it because that's what they want to hear?" Jake appreciated the honesty. "I believe it, Collins. But I understand why you might be skeptical. A year ago, I would have thought it was all nonsense too. It's just, this place is so different from what I expected. I thought I'd be doing important work, but mostly I just get yelled at for folding my clothes wrong." Jake nodded. I felt exactly the same way. The difference is, I let that frustration turn into anger. And that anger led to the biggest mistake of my military career. You still have time to make a different choice. What do you mean? I mean, you can choose to see this time as preparation for the important work you want to do, or you can choose to see it as pointless harassment. Both perspectives exist in the same reality, but they'll lead to completely different outcomes for your career. Collins looked thoughtful. "How do I change my perspective?" "Start by focusing on what you can control. You can't control how much your drill sergeants yell at you, but you can control how well you perform your duties. You can't control the pace of training, but you can control how much effort you put into learning." Over the following weeks, Jake worked closely with Collins and several other recruits who were struggling with the transition to military life. He shared his own experiences, taught them practical skills for managing stress and frustration, and helped them understand that their current challenges were preparing them for greater responsibilities. As his year in the leadership program drew to a close, Jake reflected on how completely his life had changed. The angry, frustrated private who had confronted General Hayes in the mess hall had been transformed into a confident leader who took pride in helping others succeed. On his last day in the program, Sergeant Major Thompson called him into his office. "Sergeant Morrison," Thompson began, "in 20 years of working with problem soldiers, I've never seen a more complete transformation than yours." "Thank you, Sergeant Major. This program saved my career." "No, Jake, you saved your career. The program just gave you the tools and the opportunity. You did the work." Thompson handed him a manila folder. "These are your new orders. You're being assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division as a squad leader. It's a challenging assignment, but I think you're ready for it." Jake opened the folder and read the orders. The 82nd Airborne was one of the most elite units in the Army. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined being trusted with such an assignment. "Sergeant Major, I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by remembering what you've learned here. Remember that leadership is about service, not power. Remember that every soldier under your command is someone's son or daughter, and they deserve your very best effort. I will, Sergeant Major. That evening, Jake packed his belongings and prepared for his new assignment. As he folded his uniforms, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. A year ago, he had been a failure on the verge of discharge. Now he was a sergeant heading to one of the Army's premier units. But the most important change wasn't his rank or his assignment. The most important change was in how he saw himself and his role in the Army. He was no longer just a soldier following orders. He was a leader responsible for the welfare and development of other soldiers. The next morning, as Jake prepared to leave for his new assignment, he received an unexpected message. He was ordered to report to General Hayes's office before departing the base. When he knocked on her office door, Jake felt none of the terror he had experienced a year earlier. He was still respectful and professional, but he was no longer afraid. "Sergeant Morrison, please come in," General Hayes said, looking up from her desk with a slight smile. "Thank you, ma'am. I wanted to see you before you left for Fort Bragg. I've been following your progress in the leadership program, and I must say, I'm impressed." "Thank you, ma'am. The program was exactly what I needed." "Sergeant Morrison, do you remember what I told you the day we discussed your options?" Jake thought back to that terrifying meeting. "You told me not to thank you until I had successfully completed the program and become the kind of soldier you believed I could be." "That's correct." "Well, you've successfully completed the program, and from what I can see, you've become exactly the kind of soldier I hoped you would. So, I suppose it's appropriate for me to accept your thanks now." "Thank you, General Hayes. You saved my career when I didn't deserve it." "Actually, Sergeant Morrison, I think you did deserve it. Not because of what you had done, but because of what I believed you could become. Leadership is often about seeing potential where others see only problems." General Hayes stood up and walked around her desk. "I have one final lesson for you, Sergeant. The incident in the mess hall was not the defining moment of your military career. This conversation is. What happened a year ago was a mistake made by an angry, frustrated young man. What's happening now is the result of a mature soldier taking responsibility for his growth and development." She extended her hand. "Good luck at Fort Bragg, Sergeant Morrison. I have no doubt that you'll make your country proud." As Jake shook her hand, he realized that the foolish soldier who had struck a general in the mess hall truly was gone. In his place stood a leader who understood that respect was earned through service, that leadership was about lifting others up, and that sometimes the worst mistakes could lead to the most important lessons. 3 years later, Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison would be recommended for Officer Candidate School. 5 years later, Lieutenant Morrison would be serving as a platoon leader in Afghanistan. And 10 years later, Captain Morrison would be telling the story of his mess hall mistake to a new generation of officers, teaching them that leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them and using those lessons to become better leaders and better people. The story of the foolish soldier who confronted a general became a legend on the base, but not in the way Jake had originally feared. It became a story of redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of taking responsibility for one's actions. And every time it was told, it reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the moment you think your career is over is actually the moment your real career begins.